I missed the Pokemon craze of my generation. I wasn't really allowed to have my own video game system until after the excitement of generations 3, 4, 5, and most of 6, so I was introduced to Pokemon later than many of my peers. The first game I played in the franchise was Emerald, emulated on my iPhone 5C. Remember the iPhone 5C? Well, I sure do. After Emerald, I played Alpha Sapphire and Moon a few years later, and I've been playing Go consistently since the day it came out. During the first few years of the Nintendo Switch's life, I started playing Pokemon less. I initially skipped out on Sword and Shield due to my disappointment with Dexit, and I didn't pick up Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl at the time due to all the negative reception it got. I have no idea why I didn't get Let's Go Pikachu Eevee. I guess I just forgot or something. Despite all of that, for some reason, with the release of Pokemon Legends Arceus, I gained a new obsession with the franchise. I was really excited for it, since it seemed like it was mixed up the formula in a really fun way. That was the first time that I completed the entire Pokédex in a game, and I absolutely loved doing it. I knew that after that experience that I really love catching Pokemon, because it's not only really fun to go hunt everything I need, but I love to strategize how I'm going to do some of it in advance. Throughout 2022, I finally got around to playing Pokemon Sword and Pokemon Brilliant Diamond in anticipation for the release of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Because I knew I had another massive dex coming later that year, I didn't have the motivation to catch them all in these games, at the time at least. Finally, in November, with Scarlet and Violet releasing, I began registering all 400 Pokemon in the Paldea Dex. By the end of that year, with some help from a couple friends who owned Scarlet, I had registered all the Pokemon in a game once again, and I felt pretty satisfied by this point. I was more in Pokemon than ever before. While I knew the DLC for Violet was on the horizon, and I was looking forward to that, I otherwise didn't have any Pokemon plans for 2023. I knew I probably wanted to play a Kanto, Johto, Unova, or Kalos game to completion to check another generation off my list, but beyond that, I was just going to go with the flow. Little did I know that this was all about to change. I was sitting in the student union at my undergraduate university one late January afternoon with my friend Freddy, another fan of Pokemon. I'm not sure how the conversation got to this. I think it was the 1000 Encounters video that had been released by the Pokemon Company a few weeks prior, but in that moment, I realized that if somebody had one copy of every traditional Pokemon game on the Nintendo Switch, counting 2 versions of games as one, they could almost get a full national dex. I don't know what powerful, corrupting force came over me, but I suddenly said to him, "What if I caught them all on the Switch?" Or something like that, I don't remember. The idea was in my head now, and I couldn't let go of it. When I got back from campus, I got to work on a spreadsheet that would help me with what I would soon begin to call Project Gotta Catch Them All, or Project GCTA for short, was my personal challenge to collect 1,111 Pokemon. Now you may notice that number is a bit higher than the 1,008 Pokemon that were out when I was starting the challenge, but I'll get to that in a second. This challenge had a few self-imposed rules for one reason or another, so I'll dive into those now. Rule number 1. I could only use the Switch games unless I absolutely had no way to get a Pokemon on the system. I wanted to avoid anything older than Let's Go, since the whole reason I thought the challenge was because of the availability of Pokemon on the Switch specifically. But there were some cases, of course, where I had to use the 3DS games, and in very few rare cases, Pokemon Go. When I first started the challenge, there were a decent number of species that I either had no idea how to get on the Switch yet, or were simply not available, so I transferred them from Go, since I originally had Go as a higher priority than 3DS games for some reason. Throughout the rest of the challenge, I would do what are called Go fixes, which is just getting the applicable Pokemon in a Switch game or a 3DS game and swapping it for the Go counterpart. I should also note that if there was no way to obtain a Pokemon at all, I was allowed to trade for it, but only if I was sure it was a legitimate copy. I'm glad that I did this, since otherwise I'd probably still be waiting for some mythicals for a very long time. Rule number 2. I wanted to have 2 of every Pokemon, with one being in home and the other being somewhere else in the Pokemon world. The Pokemon world, in this case, is the Switch games, or if needed, the other copy was allowed to be in Go. I am pretty sure I could have just had this rule without allowing Go to count, and it wouldn't have made the challenge particularly harder, but it would have just taken a lot more time, and not the fun strategizing time, but the grinding through different games just to catch a single Pokemon time. So essentially, I wanted one of each Pokemon in home that came from a Switch game, 3DS game if not a Switch game, and Go or trading in an absolute worst case scenario. The Pokemon then needed a counterpart in either a Switch game or Go, although I definitely preferred it to be in a Switch game. You may be asking why I went through with this whole double rule. It's because I felt like the home collection was sort of a museum, and I didn't want that to be the only place I had some Pokemon. At least that's what I tell myself to justify that maddening decision. Rule number 3. Shinies don't exist. Also known as the Eternatus Clause, this rule simply says that a shiny Pokemon did not count in any shape or form for the challenge. This rule essentially existed because I had a shiny event Eternatus and Sword that would have seemingly made my life a lot easier, although in the end it wouldn't have mattered. But I didn't feel like that it was fair, so I added this rule. Rule number 4. Avoid trades. I know I already touched on this, but I thought it could use some elaboration. Unless absolutely necessary, I should be the one obtaining a given Pokemon. Trading with an NPC doesn't count as trading, although I generally tried to breed new copies of a traded Pokemon so that I would have them with my trainer ID, but this wasn't important. This rule was simply there so that I actually caught as much as I could, as opposed to just trading for harder to find species and breeding them. This rule doesn't matter too much, however, since I was going for a living dex, which would discourage me from trying to swap rare Pokemon for another unless they absolutely had to, like with Mythicals. Rule number 5. No buying anything extra. All I could use were the Switch and 3DS games I already owned, as well as the DLC for the 2 mainline Switch games. I was of course allowed to pay for the home premium plan to store all these Pokemon, but besides that, no new purchases. On the Switch, I own Let's Go Pikachu, Sword, Brilliant Diamond, Legends Arceus, and Violet. On the 3DS, I own X, Alpha Sapphire, Moon, and Ultra Moon, although only 2 of those ended up coming into play. And finally, rule number 6. No nicknames. This only applied for the Pokemon in home, but I just didn't feel like they should have any nicknames. As I mentioned, these Pokemon felt like they were part of a museum, so it didn't feel right. That's all the official rules that I have to stick to, but there were some little things, like avoiding breeding or evolving, that became part of the challenge over time, although they weren't hard rules that I had to stick to. Now, with that out of the way, let's talk about the initial 1,111 Pokemon that I decided to catch. To start, we have the 1,008 species and soon after 1,010 species that have a national dex number. I added in Walking Wake and Iron Leaves after the fact to replace 2 forms of 2 certain species I wanted to avoid, but you'll see where they ended up later. Besides the full national dex at the time, I included the 18 Alolan forms, 19 Galarian forms, 16 Hisuian forms, and 4 Paldean forms, for a total of 57 regional forms. I also decided to include all 3 Burmy forms, all 3 Wormadam forms, the west and east versions of Shellos and Gastrodon, all 6 Rotom forms, red, white, and blue striped Basculin, all 4 season forms of Deerling and Sawsbuck, all 5 colors of Flabebe, Floette, and Florges, all 4 Oricorio styles, all 3 Lycanroc forms, Amped and Low-Key Toxtricity, Family of 3 and Family of 4 Mousehold, all 4 Squawkabilly colors, all 3 Tatsugiri forms, and finally, both Chest and Roaming form Gimmighoul. Why did I include all these extras? Well, the regional forms just felt like they made a lot of sense, and well, the other stuff just seemed easy enough to do, so I thought might as well include them. With all of these added up, I had a nice pretty number of 1,111, which probably seems purposeful, but was just a total coincidence. Once I had constructed my list, I began transforming my spreadsheet into an ultimate guide for the challenge ahead. I started off by marking down where I could find a given species if I knew off the top of my head. I had a priority order if Pokemon appeared in multiple games, that order being Legends, then Violet, then Let's Go Pikachu, then Sword, and finally Brilliant Diamond. I'm not exactly sure why Let's Go was over Sword, but Brilliant Diamond was at the bottom since it felt like the most annoying game to catch stuff in. And Legends and Violet, respectively, are in the top slot because they're the games I have the most fun playing and, more importantly, most fun catching in. After hours of scrolling through Cerebi, I had a mostly correct list of how you obtain all the Pokemon. There were a decent number of cases, mainly regional forms, where I thought I couldn't get them in the Switch games, but I eventually found a method one way or another, some of which I'll dig into later. Finally, with the locations located and the list locked in, I began my challenge on January 28, 2023. This was coincidentally the 1-year anniversary of Legends Arceus, which is even better as it was the first game I was planning on playing. With that minutia-filled introduction out of the way, let me finally begin telling the tale of how I managed to catch them all. Now before I actually started playing any of the games, I already had some Pokemon I could count for in Pokemon Home. First off, I had the gift Melmetal that you get for connecting the Go. This was quite convenient since it's the only Melmetal with a non-Go origin mark, making it perfect for the challenge. I also had a Deoxys that I had transferred from Go for some unknown reason years ago, but I kept it, as this was when I had Go above 3DS games priority-wise. Once I made the switch, I brought up my Deoxys from my Alpha Sapphire playthrough all those years ago, and sent the Go Deoxys to hang out in Brilliant Diamond. A similar thing happened with Genesect, with the Go Genesect being replaced with my 20th anniversary distribution Genesect. Beyond the mythicals, I had a bunch of random Pokemon lying around in my Legends Arceus boxes, which conveniently included stuff like 2/3 of the Hisuian starter Final Evolutions and Fion. Capping off the already ready Pokemon, I had the Galar and Hisuian starters from the Home Connection gifts, and a random Sizzlipede that I caught in Sword during the Fire Gym test. At this point, I had 24 Pokemon, which is pitiful against the grand total, but considering this is after 0 hours of playtime and includes multiple mythicals, I was pretty happy with this lineup. After dumping the extras from my Arceus boxes, I began playing the first game of the challenge, Pokemon Legends Arceus. Despite my aforementioned catching priority order, I wasn't catching every single Pokemon in the Hisui decks in Hisui. I namely wanted to avoid the space-time distortion only Pokemon, since those are so unpredictable and generally rare. Despite this, I somehow managed to get a good chunk of these from distortions just while catching everything else, including all 3 Porygon somehow. I also intentionally got the Gen 4 fossils and the rest of the Hisui starter lines this way, since at the time this was the best way to get these on the Switch in my opinion. Besides these, all of the standard species were very straightforward to catch. This was especially easy since Arceus has by far the most amount of Pokemon in the wild that normally are evolution only. In fact, in multiple cases, with Pokemon such as Golem and Rhyperior, this is the first and in most cases only times these Pokemon have been available to catch in the wild outside of Pokemon Go. Since this was before the Daybreak update and there weren't massive mass outbreaks, there were a few exceptions, and these were unfortunately mostly the new species. This is unfortunate because pretty much all of them have pretty annoying evolution methods, so I'm very glad that the massive mass outbreaks gives you a way to just outright catch them now. It was also a lot harder to get the baby Pokemon than it is now, but I was pretty used to this hunt from when I got my entire dex to level 10. After obtaining all of the non-legendary and mythical species, minus a couple space-time distortion exceptions, I was already done with Legends for the time being. I had a soft rule that I couldn't touch my living decks within Legends, so I'd have to replay the entire game and post-game for all the legendaries. Considering an Amorous is only in this game and is one of the last legendaries that you get, I was gonna have to do this anyway, which is great because now I can blame it all on an Amorous, which is already my least favorite Pokemon. I'll talk about the replays later on, but man, this game is really fun to just catch Pokemon in. I know that is sort of the point, since the end goal is to finish your decks, but I think they really nailed it. This was a really fun way to start off the challenge and get a couple hundred Pokemon knocked out really easily. The next game I went through was Violet, but I'm going to talk about that in a bit later because while I played and caught most of the Pokemon I needed for it right after, I wasn't able to transfer them to home until late May. Because of this, the next game I decided to tackle was, for some reason, Let's Go Pikachu. Let's Go Pikachu has the totally interesting, I swear, distinction of being the only Switch game that I hadn't played at all prior to starting the challenge. Because of this, as well as the nature of the game also prioritizing catching, although in a very different way, I was able to catch Pokemon naturally during a playthrough and evolve them as I went along. I didn't intend on doing a living dex for this game, frankly because the box kind of works weirdly in this game, but I did want to get a regular dex completed eventually. This meant that if a Pokemon was in this game, I should probably catch it, even if I already had one in Violet. Also, due to the lack of home compatibility of Scarlet and Violet, if I caught something I needed that I already had in Violet, I would just use that one instead of the Violet copy because why not, you know? The only really notable catch in this game that I had to get specifically for this challenge was Kangaskhan. There were other difficult ones, but thankfully they were much easier in other games. Kangaskhan is in the Isle of Armor, but for some stupid reason, I didn't get around to buying the DLC for Sword yet, and I just kind of forgot Kangaskhan was in the Isle of Armor. Anyway, the issue of Kangaskhan is that not only is it a 1% spawn rate encounter, but it only spawns in one area, which happens to be a cramped cave area. Luckily, you can reset the spawns easily by going up and down a ladder, and you can see multiple at once, but this still took way too long to find. Long, as in I found a shiny Golbat before I found a Kangaskhan. Beyond that annoying exception, I caught everything I needed as I traveled through Kanto and swapped them out here and there to evolve them. Thankfully, evolving is a lot easier in this game since a lot of this game in general is easier. But one thing I had to get done in this game was the NPC trades for the Alolan forms. You can get most of them in Let's Go Pikachu, with the exception of Alolan Meowth and Alolan Vulpix. My initial plan for those two was to catch copies and go, since I didn't think there was another way, but luckily I found a solution later down the line. For the rest of them, I thought this was the easiest way to get them, or in many cases, the only, since the Indigo Disc DLC that brought a bunch of these back in the wild wasn't out yet. To finish off Let's Go, I decided to get the legendary birds and Mewtwo here. I absolutely did not need to catch them here, as I was going to encounter them in multiple other ways on my quest, but I thought it would be fitting to have the legendaries that started it all from their home region. Also, I wanted Mewtwo specifically in a Master Ball, and this game made the most sense to do that in. Brilliant Diamond is a game alright. Because this game feels pretty slow to me in so many ways, I wanted to minimize my time in it. The whole, if I get it here, just use that instead of the Violet version principle applies here too, although it only came up a few times since I didn't actually need to catch anything extra, so it mainly came up when I was trying to level up. Besides these, most of what I was getting was in the Grand Underground, which meant a lot of entering and exiting doors and hearing the Grand Underground theme a lot. I'm pretty sure that I quickly muted my game and just threw up a YouTube video during this segment since I was hearing that same darn song so much. Catching these Pokemon was also kind of obnoxious since they were around level 60 due to the level scaling of the Grand Underground, so they weren't safe catches ever. Thankfully, I did eventually prevail and get all the Grand Underground Pokemon, which basically boiled down to the Pokemon too forgettable to put in any of the Switch games, besides BDSP, which is funny because most of these would actually end up showing up in Kitakami a few months later, and I also decided to get the Generations 1 through 3 starters here, which is also ironic because they would show up in Blueberry Academy a couple more months later, where they were significantly easier to catch. The other type of regular encounter I had to deal with was the Trophy Garden. This was basically just for Plusle, Minion, and Castform. Because of how the garden works, I had to check it for a week or two to get them in the rotation, which wasn't too bad, but it did make me get sick of the Trophy Garden guy lying to me. I know you're importing behind my back, buddy. In terms of legendaries and mythicals, there were only a few I actually needed to get in this game, but I decided to get a few more for kicks. I used the Dialga I had caught during the story for the home decks, as well as Uxie since I had caught it for some reason. I had luckily gotten the game early enough to get the Darkrai and Shaman events, so I got those here, although I did miss the Manaphy event, but thankfully I was able to get that during my Legends Arceus replay. In terms of what I actually needed to get, I had to grab Latias, Regigigas, and Arceus. You may have noticed a lack of Kyogre, which at the time was only obtainable here, at least with the games I had, but I was banking on the Violet DLC having it available to catch. Not sure why I didn't think the same for Latias, but whatever. Latias was pretty straightforward. I just had to get enough Mysterious Shards to encounter and catch the OG Reggie trio, which would end up joining my Violet collection as I would catch the Reggies again in Sword, and then finally, Latias. Because I already had the Hoenn Reggies, I used them to get Regigigas, which, while available in Sword, is much harder to get there. Finally, since you can encounter Arceus again if you catch it in its titular game, I was able to ascend into the Hall of Origin and complete the Brilliant Diamond segment of this challenge. Except there were two more mythicals I had to get here, Jirachi and Mew. Both are gifts for having saves of other games, which I did already have, and had to claim both gifts during my regular playthrough. Jirachi got out join the home collection right away, but Mew stayed in Brilliant Diamond all the way until the end of the challenge. In Pokemon Home, if you obtain every single Pokemon up to Eternatus number 890, you get the original colored Magearna. I didn't want this reward until I caught everything up to Iron Leaves, so I made sure that something wasn't in the dex yet that was before Eternatus, so I wouldn't get the gift until I was done, in the event that the last Pokemon I caught was after 890. I chose Mew since it felt like a fitting last Pokemon, being the last member of the Kanto dex and all. One more note about Brilliant Diamond. Due to that infamous coding error where Spinda can't be transferred into BDSP and you can't transfer Spinda from BDSP out, I had to catch Spinda in Alpha Sapphire, but I did catch a Spinda in Brilliant Diamond just for the sake of completion, since you can technically get Spinda on the Switch this way, just not send it to home. Now, with Brilliant Diamond truly out of the way, it's finally time to talk about the Pokemon game that I have by far the most hours in, Pokémon Violet. Oh, Pokémon Violet. A game that's really fundamentally fun, bogged down by poor graphics and even worse performance. Oh well, luckily it's still fun to actually play. Anyway, this is the game with the most amount of catches. I think about 500, including the DLC, came from Violet alone. But similarly, like Legends, because this game made encountering and finding Pokemon a lot more fun, this wasn't too much of a drag at all. Even Golden Go, a Pokemon notorious for being annoying to get, wasn't terrible since by the time I had caught most of the other Pokemon, the chest form and Gimmighoul throughout the region had all respawned, so I was able to do a lap around Paldea and get about 850 of the 999 coins I needed. Family 3 Mousehold is another one that is generally considered hard to get, but there's a neat thing where if you find one in a Terra raid, there's like a 1/2 or 1 out of 3 chance that it's a family of 3. This took a few days to find in my game, but once I found a Mousehold, it was thankfully the rare variant. The only things that were annoying to get in the base game, not including the replays that I would have to do eventually, were the Paradox Pokemon exclusive to Scarlet. The initial set I had wasn't actually annoying to get, since I just swapped version exclusives with my friends. No, it was when I realized there was a way I could get them with my own OT on my main save. Like I mentioned, getting Pokemon with my own OT wasn't important, but I really wanted to try to do with these just to see if it would even work. Basically, by the time I tried this, I had a Scarlet save on my Switch Lite that had beaten the game. If you join a union circle with someone of the opposite version, the way spawns are determined is based on who enters the area first. So if I'm playing Violet and want, say, Stunky, my friend playing Scarlet would have to walk around until they spawned a Stunky, then I could walk up to the Stunky and counter it like normal. The thing is, Area 0 doesn't work with a union circle. Well, it's not supposed to anyway. If you and the person you're playing with enter Area 0, you can actually spawn Pokemon in, including the Paradox Pokemon. But for some ungodly reason, they're invisible to the person who didn't spawn them in. They also just have some weird finickiness with how they despawn, so it's overall a lot harder than the regular spawns, but it is possible. After spending I think about 30 to 45 minutes, I'd slowly but surely caught each of the Scarlet Paradox Pokemon on my own main Violet save. Now, to address the title of this section. As I've mentioned, Pokemon Home wasn't compatible with Scarlet and Violet for a while, all the way until late May. Because of this, my boxes got full and messy within Violet, getting even messier due to me maintaining a living dex within the game itself. This messy box issue wasn't really an issue until I had about 95% of the Pokemon in Home for the entire challenge. Because I hadn't sorted my Pokemon in any of the games I had played, especially Violet, they were all out of order and I wanted it to be nice and in order before I finished. When the YouTuber Johnstone did his Catch 'em All challenge stream, he said it took him about 4 hours to sort his boxes, which is what I was expecting for my sorting process. It took me 8.5. If I hadn't had some friends on a voice call during the multiple sessions it took to do this, I think I might have gone actually insane. Especially when I messed up and put Slowking in Kanto and didn't notice until halfway through Johto. Or when I forgot to put Alolan Raichu in Kanto for a while. It's a miracle I came out of that experience with my sanity. Oh right, this segment was about Violet. All in all, base game Violet was pretty manageable. It just had a lot of Pokemon. Once we get to the DLC and replays, there are some more difficult cases, but for now, I was finally able to move on to the last Switch game I owned. Keyword owned. Pokemon Sword. Like a large chunk of the Pokemon fanbase, I think that Sword and Shield are some of the weakest outings in the franchise. They're technically sound, have loads of quality of life improvements, but they're just such basic Pokemon games. I was excited to try out the wild area a lot more, but beyond that I wasn't jazzed about playing a lot more of this one. Luckily, a lot of the Pokemon in Galar are also in Paldea, including the version exclusive Appleton, which is made trivial to obtain in both Scarlet and Violet. Of the Pokemon stuck in Sword and Shield, there were 3 particular annoying cases. The Alola Dragon Duo, the Shield exclusives, and the 4 fossils. The Alola Dragon Duo consists of the version exclusives Turtonator and Drampa. By this point, I had determined I could get version exclusives by catching a Pokemon in Go and sending it to Sword and then breeding it there, which worked for every single species that I needed it to for at the time, except for Drampa. I say at the time because later down the line, all of the version exclusives that I needed to do this with ended up in Scarlet and Violet except for Lunatone. So, if you wanted to do this nowadays, you'd have to do this with Drampa and Lunatone only. The issue at the time was, you couldn't get Drampa in Go. Because of this, I had seemingly no way to get Drampa without playing Shield. Luckily, I did actually have to play Shield already anyway to get Zamazenta, and I did have a plan on how, without getting extra money, I'll talk about in a bit. Even if the availability issue solved for Drampa, I still had to actually encounter it and Turtonator, which is much easier said than done. For both Turtonator and Drampa, they could only be encountered in one area of the wild area, during one specific, uncommon weather type, at a 2% encounter rate. Only as a grass encounter, so I couldn't even look for them in the overworld. For this challenge, I made a point of not switching the weather manually, so yes, I had to wait until the rare weather type showed up in each game. Both of them took at least an hour, with Turtonator taking close to an hour and a half to find one. I found the other 2% chance spawn, Stonejourner, 3 times during this hunt. Speaking of version exclusives, while I thought I had all the other regular exclusives figured out, I was actually unsure how to get things like Galarian Ponyta and Galarian Corsola. After doing some digging with how breeding works, I found the solution. If you have a Pokemon that has a regional form and you breed its base form in said region, then it will still give eggs of the regional form. I simply caught an extra Ponyta and Arceus, and of course some Brilliant Diamond, and sent them the Sword, bred them, and got the Galarian Shield exclusives. Oh, and remember when I mentioned I found a solution for the Let's Go version exclusive Alolan forms? Similarly to the previous trick, if you have a Pokemon of a specific regional form hold in Everstone, it will always give you eggs of that specific version. Getting a bit ahead of myself by talking about the DLC, but Alolan Meowth and Alolan Vulpix are both available in the Isle of Armor, so after finding enough Alolan Diglets to get them as gifts, I bred them a couple times and finally finished off the Alolan forms. Finally, the fossils. These weren't hard in an interesting way, they were hard in a mashing A through the digging duo guy's dialogue who had a chance to give you one of the fossils over and over until I had enough to get 2 of each fossil Pokemon way. At least I had enough watts to do this since I never used them otherwise, but man, that was just tedious. Sword was also the game where I got most of my legendaries, and all of my Ultra Beasts, most of which were found in Dynamax Adventures. There was the issue of the Shield only raids, which I was waiting to deal with until Scarlet and Violet got its DLC, since I had hoped that all the legendaries would be catchable again, with Violet getting the Shield legendaries this time. Luckily, this gambit mostly paid off. I also of course caught the static Keldeo and the Crown Tundra to up my mythical count. With Sword finally finished around early June 2023, you'd think that it'd almost be done. If I remember correctly, by this point I already had over 1,000 Pokemon, but as I knew going into this challenge, the last few Pokemon would be exponentially harder than the first 1,000. This phase was headlined by the beginning of the most tedious part of the challenge, replaying games. But first, I want to talk about an addition to the project that I came up with around this time, that would add a whole new layer to this challenge. I mentioned earlier that the forms I left out would show up later. Well, here we are. Project Gotta Catch Them All Plus, or GCTA Plus for short, is an extension of GCTA that covers all of the remaining forms and any future Pokemon and forms added to the series. With this in mind, I don't expect GCTA Plus to ever be complete. Even if I get everything I'm missing currently, there will still be new additions to the franchise all the time, so I'm really just doing it as a rolling thing. All of the previously established rules still apply, so some Pokemon of multiple forms were going to be a real pain in the ass to get, 2 of which will get their own segments later on. Besides the different forms, I also added all of the gender variants and the Scarlet and Violet DLC Pokemon as they were added. At the time, I didn't add Dada, Zarude, Hat Pikachus, and the Furfrou trims, as I thought that the costume events might never come back and the Furfrou trims were actually impossible to get, but I would add all 3 types eventually despite my prior feelings. As of the writing of this script in late November 2024, I'm still missing the following from Gotta Catch Them All Plus. All of the Hat Pikachus, Therian Thundurus, Pokeball Vivillon, Hoopa Unbound, Therian Enamorus, 3-segment Dunsparce, Gouging Fire, and Raging Bolt. The Therian forms will be caught in an eventual Arceus 3rd playthrough, probably a bit before ZA comes out. I'm banking on Pokeball Vivillon being the wild Vivillon for ZA, but if it isn't, I think we're due for another event soon. I plan on getting Hoopa in ZA as well, and I have bred so many Dunsparce and have yet to get a single 3-segment. I just need to sit down one day and hatch eggs until I get to. Which apparently might be a while, because like the shiny Golbat and Kanto, I got a shiny Dunsparce while looking for a single 3-segment. For the rest of it, I'm just gonna have to trade for them eventually, but that's okay. And I'm not really in a rush to finish Gotta Catch Them All Plus, since there isn't the pressure I felt to finish the main challenge. Which is great, because I really don't want to replay Arceus again too soon and sour the whole experience. Hey, speaking of replays, let's talk about those, shall we? In total, not counting my main regular playthroughs, I had to play Arceus 1 extra time, Scarlet and Violet 2 extra times, and Sword and Shield to completion 3 extra times, with 2 playthroughs that just got an hour and a half in. The first replay of Violet let me get all the legendaries besides Koraidon, including the DLC legendaries which I'll get to in a bit. Arceus allowed me to catch Thundurus, Enamorus, and Palkia, all of which I could only get there. Sword and Shield replays let me get a second Eternatus, Zamazenta, multiple type Null, some of the Ultra Beasts and other legendaries not in Go yet, and the DLC legendaries. You may be wondering how I was able to play Shield and Scarlet considering my rule of not buying any more games. Well, it's because I'm lucky. Some libraries, including my local library, happen to let you check out video games, including of course Pokemon games. I would play these games on my Switch Lite and just trade the Pokemon to my main saves. I'm also thankful that DLC is system-wide, since otherwise I have no idea how I was going to get multiples of DLC-only legendaries, but luckily I could just use one of my other Switch profiles and replay it that way. During these replays, I found a shiny Yanma in Arceus and a shiny Hoppip in Violet. Those 2 and the Golbat from earlier make up the shinies that I found explicitly from doing this challenge, which is about 2 more than I expected, so that's nice. I also had to play through a 3DS game for the challenge, that being Pokemon X. I bought the game off Facebook Marketplace a few years ago, but just never got around to it, but once I decided the 3DS was higher priority than Go, I had to go catch a few Pokemon, all of which were thankfully an X. Most of them were pretty early game, especially the elemental monkeys, but Watchog and by extension Patrat were all the way in like the last third of the game. I could have just booted up Pokemon Black and gotten a Patrat with ease, but I didn't want to use an older game than I had to, and I wanted to play through all of X anyway. X and Y are interesting Pokemon games, since I do think they're probably the weakest entries in the franchise, not counting the first two games without the remakes, but their flaws, like the roller skates and the hand-holding, are very easy fixes, while something like Sword and Shield is more fundamentally flawed. Basically what I'm saying is I'm very excited for what they do with Kalos and Legend ZA. I don't have a natural transition for this next part, so here's the tale of the Pokemon that required the most effort in this challenge, although it's technically gotta catch them all plus. I'll get to it later, but spoiler alert, Alcremie is the only exception to the 2 of every Pokemon rule, but this wasn't always the case. The grand prize at the end of this challenge, the original Paint Magearna, was something that seemed not impossible, but incredibly unreasonable to obtain a second copy of. I would have to spend about 100 days trading between my main account and one of my other home accounts. An incredibly tedious task I was just kind of not willing to do. I thought that was that, but it was kind of always bugging me that there was always one non-breedable Pokemon breaking the second copy rule. When my friend Nobu was teasing me about that Magearna mission, it somehow finally occurred to me what the solution was. On one of my alternate home accounts, I sometimes like to wonder trade for no real reason, and one day happened to get a totally not hacked shiny Duraludon. I decided to put it up on the GTS for a Koraidon or something and actually ended up getting it. From this point on, I managed to do trade after trade, going through each generation to eventually have every legendary registered on my alt account. And from that point on, through on and off wonder trades, room trades, and touch trading mythicals to the alt account, I actually managed to register the entire national Pokédex just within home itself. A few days before I finished the primary challenge, I asked Freddy to touch trade me a Mew on my alt so I could get the Origin Magearna ready for the big day, and just like that, I managed to get what would become my second Origin Paint Magearna. I don't remember exactly how long this whole process took, but it was certainly less than 100 days, and more importantly, was a lot more entertaining for me than just mindlessly trading things back and forth. This part is dedicated to 2 Pokemon lines, both of which are lines that I not only don't particularly like to begin with, but were a pain in the ass to get for this challenge. Let's start off with that dumb karate bear, Urshifu. Cubfu is the 2nd, 3rd if you count Type Null, 4th if you count Ultra Beasts, legendary that evolves. Despite this, you can of course still only obtain 1 Cubfu per save, and since Urshifu can evolve into 2 unique forms, I needed 6 Cubfu total for the challenge, including Gotta Catch Them All Plus. Here's how I got them all! The first Cubfu was super straightforward. I just played the Isle of Armor normally, since it was my first time playing it, and eventually evolved it into a Rapid Strike Urshifu. I prefer Rapid Strike of the 2 forms, which will matter in a bit. The second Cubfu came from my second Sword playthrough, which thankfully I already had a strong team to use. I just played through up until I got the second Cubfu, and eventually evolved it into my first Single Strike Urshifu. The 3rd and 4th Cubfu were attained in the exact same way, by using my 3rd Switch account. I had a 3rd profile on my Switch I pretty much exclusively used to play Castle Crashers with my friends, so it wasn't tied to a Nintendo account, meaning I couldn't even use home with it unless I wanted to bother making it another account, and like borrowing my mom's iPad or something to run home on. Anyway, on this account, I played through about an hour of Sword getting to the wild area, heading to the Crown Tundra to quickly get a couple level 70-ish Pokemon, then heading to the Isle of Armor. The good news for me is the Isle of Armor was between level 10 to 20 because of the level scaling, so I pretty much one-shot everything in my path and got the next 2 Cubfu. Before I wiped the first save, I traded the Cubfu to my Shield save on my Switch Lite since I had a copy from the library to evolve some trade evolutions, and traded the 2nd and 3rd account Cubfu the same way. I then switched to my second Sword save and brought over one of the Cubfu up to Tower of Darkness, getting my second Single Strike Urshifu. Once the Indigo disc released, using my 2 Violet saves, I was able to get the second Cubfu and one I could evolve into Rapid Style Urshifu. The favoritism towards this form mattered because I wanted it to be the one that had the Scarlet and Violet origin mark, as well as be in my Paldea boxes, while I cared a lot less about the Single Strike one, hence why I just took the Sword one and put it in there. After all of that, I finally had obtained the legendary that I needed the most copies of for this challenge. And as a result, I never want to play the opening of Sword and Shield ever again, as I have seen it 5 times, which is 4 too many. Furfrou is just one of my least favorite Pokemon, so of course it had to be one of the most annoying group of forms to get. While I left out the Furfrou trims from Gotta Catch 'em All Plus initially, I changed my mind once I realized that because of a few trips my Pokemon Go playing mom was going on, I might be able to obtain all the trims I needed. I decided to transfer all 9 at once for no real reason, but here's the order I got them in before that. Also, for all of these, I of course still have a copy and go, so take everything I say and multiply it by 2. I first had an extra Lorraine trim and Diamond trim just lying around, so I just marked those and had them ready to go. Next, the yearly Fashion Week event came to Pokemon Go, so I was able to get more Furfrou very easily and get Matron, Dandy, and Debutante trim Furfrous. A bit before this, my mom had just gone on a trip that included a stop in Egypt, and when I saw her next, I got the Pharaoh trim I needed. The Kabuki and Star trims were almost a problem until my friend Minty mentioned she was going to Japan and Thailand for winter break. I asked her if she would be willing to download Pokemon Go and let me sign into my account before she left, and then get the trims once she was there. So, shoutouts to Minty for helping me with that, especially because she couldn't care less about Pokemon. Finally, Heart trim just required waiting for Valentine's Day in 2024. If the next time Furfrou is in a regular game you can directly put the trims in home, then of course I will swap these out, but for now, I'm just happy to be done with this dumb dog. As you might have noticed, if I had waited a year or so to start this challenge, a lot of the Pokemon would have been easier to catch due to the release of the Hidden Treasure of Area Zero DLC for Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Still, the DLC helped plug a lot of holes and introduced the first fully new species for Gotta Catch 'em All Plus. First up, the Teal Mask. Compared to the Indigo disc, the Teal Mask didn't have nearly as much that I would need to get for the challenge, but still, there was a decent amount to get done. I started by just playing through normally, which also involved getting a living dex of all of the newly added Pokemon in the Scarlet and Violet. I got some go fixes in the form of the Ducklet line and 2/3 of the Swaddle line, and adding Levani to the main challenge. I was also able to add Diplin, Counterfeit Poltergeist, and Unremarkable Sinistcha to Gotta Catch 'em All Plus. About a week after the DLC released, I learned that the Terra raids of Sinistcha have a much higher chance of having Masterpiece Sinistcha, just kinda like the Mousehold thing, and thankfully, I was able to get 2 pretty soon after. Poltergeist was a lot tougher, however, since I either had to get very lucky and find 2 in the wild, or get very lucky and get an Outbreak of all Artisan forms. Somehow, I got the Outbreak about a month after the DLC released, and caught a whole box full of them, as well as the 2 I needed for the challenge. At this point, all I needed was just the legendaries and Blood Moon Ursaluna for Gotta Catch 'em All Plus, and after quickly replaying the DLC on my second Violet save, which had already beaten the game at this point, I had everything but Blood Moon. Getting the 150 species to unlock with the Blood Moon side quest was much easier than I thought it would be, especially since I had some random evolution items and rare candies on this save that I was able to use instantly involve a lot of things that I'd already caught. I soon was faced with the Blood Moon Beast the second time and was able to add it to the collection, finishing everything I needed to do in the Teal Mask. Prior to the second half of the DLC's release, I was kind of nervous. The difficulty of a lot of the remaining catches depended on what was in this new area. This was mostly regarding legendaries, although mythicals were important too, but I'll get to those in a moment. Let's start off with what I got before even touching any of the legendaries. For go fixes, I got the Picky Peck line, Blitzel line, Snivy line, and Tepig line. For regular species, I got the Litten line and all the Minio forms, finally finishing off every single breedable/standard Pokemon species from the main challenge. For Gotta Catch 'em All Plus, I grabbed Hydrapple, Archaludon, the remaining gender variants, and every other Alcremie form. This was thankfully much easier to do than if I had attempted in Sword, although it still wasn't easy and required a lot of grinding at the item printer to get the 2 rare sweets. I mentioned earlier that this was the only Pokemon or form I don't have 2 of each for, and that's not because I wanted to stop getting sweets, but it's because I would have run out of room in my Violet boxes if I had a whole set in the game. I might eventually get the set again anyway and leave them in Sword or something, but for now, oh man, just let me have this, please. Anyways, legendary-wise, I obtained all of them on my second save, with the exception of Glastrier and Spectrier, which I just transferred from Sword into Home finally, as I caught the 2 on my main Violet save. Oh, and of course the aforementioned Cubfu thing. Beyond those 2, I actually got the Gotta Catch 'em All Pokemon first, those being Trapagos and the debatably legendary Iron Boulder and Iron Crown. Around this time, I also caught Meloetta on both of my saves. After these new additions, on December 31st, 2023, I had grinded through enough Blueberry quests and caught the last Cubfu, Lugia, Kyogre, Zekrom, and finally, Lunala, one of my favorite Pokemon of all time, making it a fitting end to the year. At this point, I had decided I had entered the final phase of the challenge, Endgame. For this challenge, I initially considered the endgame phase to be once I had to start just kind of waiting for things to happen instead of just being able to replay games, although in reality the period began once I wrapped up everything that I need to do in the Indigo disc. At the start of the endgame period, 14 Pokemon remained for the base challenge. Mew on the technicality, Victini, Yveltal, Diancie, Hoopa, Volcanion, Silvally, Magearna, Marshadow, Poipole, Naganadel, Zeraora, Zarude, and Koraidon. I've already talked about Mew, but let's look at the other 13. For Diancie, Hoopa, Volcanion, Magearna, and Zarude, I knew that they were all transferable to Violet, so I was banking on new releases of each. Silvally, Poipole, Naganadel, and Koraidon all had one copy in either Sword or Violet, with Koraidon being from my friend Freddy. And I was waiting on their releases in Pokemon Go so I could send these versions to home, as the version in Go would count for the second instance. Yveltal was the only legendary that I couldn't get in Violet, so I thought I'd have to enlist my friend Derek to help find a path in his Shield game in the Dynamax Adventures, and then let me raid it online to catch Yveltal. Finally, Victini, Marshadow, and Zeraora, well, I'll get to those later. Now, with all this in mind, let's see what happened. Oh, also there was some stuff from Gotta Catch 'em All Plus happening this entire time that isn't really important, but I thought I'd mention it anyway. Starting with Gotta Catch 'em All Plus in mid-January, I caught my first and second Petronts, both in fitting Master Balls. 2 days after I got that second Petront, I finally got an authentic Sinistea outbreak and got both authentic forms for that line as well as shiny Sinistea for kicks. In mid-February, I finished the Furfrou fiasco and soon after had a realization. The rules of the challenge were set up in a way that as long as I had a legit copy of a Pokemon somewhere that I couldn't obtain on the Switch, I could send it to home and it was fair game. Somehow, I didn't realize how this applied to Mythicals that were currently unavailable, even if they had prior distributions. After going for my 3DS games, I was able to add Victini, Volcanion, and Diancie. Fun fact about the Diancie, that was just sitting on my copy of X when I bought it from its previous owner, and it so happened to be the original distribution of Diancie. Neat! I was also able to get Zarude from my friend Maxwell, who quit Pokemon Go in 2023 and was happy to log back into his old account to help me out. He also helped me with the next two Pokemon, Poipole and Naganadel. By this point, I had one of each from my 2 Sword playthroughs, and thankfully it was finally added to Go, where I obtained my second Poipole. Maxwell then quickly did the thankfully simple tasks to grab one on his own and trade it to me. I then sent it all the way to Sword and evolved it there, finally finishing off the Ultra Beasts. After Naganadel, I had 8, counting Mew, Pokemon left at the time that I thought would either require waiting for a distribution or waiting for the recently announced Legends ZA. With the ZA's announcement, I decided against having Derek do Dynamax Adventures for Yveltal since at that point I felt like that was simply too much for me to ask of him, especially since it would be available in the future. Early in the summer of 2024, I did my now tradition of checking out a bunch of 3DS games from the library to see if they had anything good on them, and actually found an Ultra Moon copy that had been beaten, meaning I could obtain its Magearna. I then sent that Magearna and my own Magearna from Moon Up to Pokemon Home. I'll eventually beat Ultra Moon and send that Magearna up as a replacement, but for now, thank you to Lin Cow for beating the entire game and then proceeding not to redeem the Mythical I needed. After this, I realized that, like with the other Mythicals and transferring from 3DS to Go, I realized I could just trade for the last true problem Pokemon, Zeraora. My friend Freddy found someone he knew who was willing to trade it the first Zeraora, shoutouts to ShyGuy2434, and I used r/Pokemon Home to trade for the second, shoutouts to u/Tiresome Trader. With this major hurdle out of the way, I was fired up to finally finish the challenge somehow. Conveniently, Marshadow was announced to be the GoFest Mythical for Pokemon Go, and Freddy had a second with my name on it. I actually went to New York for GoFest 2024, so I was able to add it to my collection a little bit earlier, which was kind of fun. At this point, I knew that I could get Silvally and Koraidon from replaying games, and Freddy had an extra McDonald's Hoopa he was willing to give me. I was avoiding it for the time being since I knew ZA was on the horizon, but decided that if I could somehow get Yveltal, then I would trade for the Hoopa and play through Sword and Scarlet one more time to finish the challenge. After asking around some Discord servers and subreddits for a bit, I found what I had been looking for. Someone who had Yveltal already saved in their max lair. The Reddit user, who has to be credited as Scott, has been shiny hunting Yveltal and was willing to bring me along for a raid so I could catch it. After solving some technical issues that were induced by Sword having weird online, shoutouts to my friend Bobcat from Discord for helping test this, I did a Dynamax adventure with Scott, and we lost the Yveltal. Luckily, it's still safe to my game and I was able to re-challenge it right after with the CPUs, and this time I finally caught the legendary that eluded me for so long. After trading for the McDonald's Hoopa, I picked up one of my Furfrou sword saves, blasted through it in an afternoon using another team of level 70 Pokemon from the Max Lair, and grabbed Silvally. After getting a copy of Scarlet from my library right as I got Silvally, I hunkered down and used a bunch of random legendaries from my second home account to get through the game fairly quickly. On July 20th, 2024, only 4 days after obtaining Yveltal, I caught Koraidon. That was it. After sending Koraidon home, and after having it ready for almost 550 days, I placed Mew in my home boxes, and officially caught them all. This challenge was just so much fun. Sure, not everything was perfect, I really could have done without all the replays, but by and large, strategizing how to catch them all and then actually doing it was awesome. Would I do it again? Absolutely. In between and after Gotta Catch Them All, I finished every single dex in Pokemon Home, including BDSP and Let's Go. And I've started working towards a Ribbon Master of Rayquaza from Emerald. I've also amassed quite the collection of shinies at this point. Don't know if that'll ever become a thing like this, hopefully not for my sanity. The Pokemon Challenge bug has bitten me, and oh man has it been a wild ride so far. To me, a huge part of what makes Pokemon so special is the fact that you could take a Pokemon from a game released 20 years ago and sends it all the way up to the modern games. And now you can send them back a bit too. That's so undeniably cool, and in a way, I feel like this challenge was a celebration of that idea, that even if it takes multiple games across multiple systems, you can catch them all. When I first outlined the script for this video, I thought this section would be significantly longer, but all I really have to say is thank you. Thank you so much to everybody who helped me with this challenge. It would have been literally impossible without all of you, and being able to share it with you along the way was a joy. I hope I didn't drive you too insane if I talked to you about it at the time, and I thank you for watching this recap. Now, go read a book or something. That was way too long to listen to someone ramble about Pokemon.